Before this video begins, I would like to give a quick thank you to my Asban Team level patrons Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. So recently I've been making a lot of lore videos and working on the Doctor Who Iceberg series, and it made me reflect a lot upon the idea of canon and continuity in Doctor Who. When it comes to franchises and media properties, canon is a big cornerstone, a spinal cord holding things together and building a universe of consistent rules, characters and events. However, unlike other properties, Doctor Who is unique because it doesn't have a set canon. Despite fans often throwing around the term and insisting certain things are and aren't canon, there's never actually been a single figure or organisation specifying what licensed material is canon. There's no strict timelines or consistency, which you can't say about stuff like Star Wars or Star Trek. However, I've always wondered whether this is a good thing, allowing for more creativity and experimentation, or a bad thing, disregarding lore and making expanded media pretty impenetrable. So I thought today I would ask the question of, does Doctor Who actually need a canon? Okay, let's start things off by addressing the elephant in the room: time travel. At the very core of Doctor Who is the idea that the main character can travel literally anywhere in time and space, and even to parallel universes and alternate timelines. This means an almost unlimited amount of paradoxes, branching paths and shenanigans, making a traditional sense of canon impossible. The entirety of Star Wars, for example, relies upon the events of A New Hope happening and being fixed, with everything else branching off that. They literally have BBY and ABY in their calendars. You can't just take A New Hope out of canon because everything will break. You can't just release a novel saying Glup Shito actually destroyed the Death Star because it would also destroy the storytelling universe it exists within. However, with Doctor Who, you can easily just say the Empire sent time-travelling stormtroopers back to kill Luke Skywalker as a baby, and there's no way to dispute that. There's no Lucasfilm or Disney-like council of canon. This lack of canon has been something that has affected the show since the very beginning, with lots of obscure tie-in material and even the Peter Cushing Doctor Who movies creating conflicting events to what was being shown on TV at the time. Star Wars would plaster a movie like that with a billion labels declaring it as non-canon, legends, fictional, expanded media, but Doctor Who just doesn't bother. Despite Doctor Who not even having the slightest hint of an established canon, many fans are still insistent that there is one, with only the main show counting and not the litany of expanded media. Whilst it is true that the TV show does hold a higher standing than anything else, all the expanded media is still just as valid. And this does create a bit of a problem because of how much there actually is. The 90s and early 2000s specifically were a wild west of false dawns and officially licensed continuations that now awkwardly stick out due to the revival of the TV show. Things like Faction Paradox, Probe and the Virgin New Adventures create a chaotic web of contradictory and confusing canon that runs parallel to the show itself, and it's all very messy. There are even entire incarnations of the Doctor, like the Schalke Doctor, that were meant to be official continuations, only to now exist in some kind of weird grey area because of their lack of canon. As fans, we're just kind of left to explain it as being alternate timelines or whatever, but that's on us. There's no official guidelines for these kinds of situations, and it means there are all these loose ends and a lot of fragmentation when it comes to licensing. Sure, you can say the Schalke Doctor isn't canon, but what about things like the Lethbridge Stewart novels, Time Hunter or Vince Cosmos? Spin-offs with fully licensed characters from other Doctor Who media. Messy doesn't even begin to describe this fragmentation chaos. By this point, Doctor Who expanded media far outweighs the on-screen material. It's a nearly unassailable iceberg at this point. There are very few easy places to start. Let's say you start with the Dalek Universe Big Finish box set because of the 10th Doctor. That ends up sending you down a rabbit hole of Mark 7 being from a Dalek specific annual released in 1966. Yeah, despite there being so much fragmented expanded media, most of it still tries to be interconnected, so it becomes this mess where you can never truly see the bigger picture because it's so hard to get started. However, again, this isn't necessarily as bad as it would be in a franchise with a strict canon. It's not that different to someone like Sarah Jane coming back in School Reunion, despite the new younger audience having no idea Doctor Who existed before 2005. Most Doctor Who media tends to assume you don't know who all these obscure characters are, and that's a very good thing. Of course, there'll always be some snooty fans who look down on you for not being familiar with Absalom Dark or Penelope Gate, but on the whole, nobody really expects you to know the Incomplete Death's Head or Doctor Who and the Freefall Warriors, and that's a really good thing because there's so many stories that nobody should expect anyone else to actually know about them all. Unlike those other big media properties that need to adhere to a pretty strict canon, Doctor Who is afforded a lot of creative liberties. All the time travel shenanigans basically means there's no point in trying to enforce heavy rules because it would just be a headache. Everything causes some sort of clash or continuity nightmare. Just look at Series 5 suggesting the Doctor still wasn't very familiar with the Weeping Angels, only for a bunch of expanded media stories to pair basically every earlier incarnation with the villains. It's a huge continuity mess, but you know who cares? No one. Whilst things like Star Wars and Star Trek need everything to fit neatly, otherwise the fans lose their minds, Doctor Who has just kind of trained us fans to go along with it. There's no canon, so either it all counts or none of it counts. It's uniquely malleable that way. However, this does make it very hard to centralise lore and continuity. I've always been very jealous of how more consistent franchises get in-depth reference books, really fleshing things out like locations, backstories, items, and events. When it comes to Doctor Who though, reference books are basically pointless. They usually just recap events from the show and almost never add any actual new lore of their own. Part of this is probably editorial choices, but it also does seem like a big consequence of this refusal to adhere to a canon. Anytime they try to centralise lore like with Daleks or Cybermen backstories, it all just gets contradicted and rewritten almost immediately after. So it's a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think another big issue arriving from this canon fluid approach is when the show adapts expanded media stories. We've seen this quite often to varying degrees. Obviously, as early as 2005, the episode Dalek was loosely adapted from the Big Finish audio Jubilee. Before, Rise of the Cybermen took a lot of concepts from Spare Parts, and Human Nature was a straight up adaptation of the 90s novel of the same name. There have been many of these examples of the show reaching into its expanded universe to create episodes, but this almost always leads to some sort of controversy amongst hardcore fans. Besides the usual "the book was better" arguments like we've seen with episodes like the Star Beast, it also upsets people who believe the original stories are somehow being erased from canon, despite canon not actually existing. After all, it's hard to imagine the events of Human Nature could happen twice, and both instances of the Star Beast have the Doctor meeting the Meep for the very first time, so they can't exist within the same timeline. This creates that same centralisation issue I was just talking about, making it hard for things to remain consistent and live in harmony. However, once again, it's a double-edged sword, since the original Star Beast comic introduced an entire companion, so overwriting it by making it quote-unquote non-canon, whilst making the TV episode quote-unquote canon, would create a significant knock-on effect. It's very much the same as Mary Shelley appearing in Series 12, despite Big Finish having already made her an entire companion of the 8th Doctor. With canon, you face a big headache, since only one of these events can be true, they can't coexist together. But with the smooth sailing of Doctor Who not having canon, you can just sit back and enjoy both without having to worry about which one is the real scenario, and that just makes things a lot easier in that regard. However, there is one pretty major example of Doctor Who trying to establish a set canon of sorts. The first Russell T Davies era crafted an intricately detailed and interconnected shared universe. It essentially started things with a clean slate and built upon that with events and characters that affected others. Big Ben gets destroyed by the Slovene, next time it appears it's being rebuilt. Downing Street gets blown up, next time that appears the destruction is acknowledged. The Centaurans attempt to invade Earth, have a survivor appear as a villain of a spin-off episode. Everything was connected and cohesive, weaving this rich tapestry of storytelling on Earth where events actually mattered, and it strengthened the impact and emotion of events and character arcs down the line. The first Davies era is a complete package with a clear start point and end point. Almost every story beat and character arc is resolved by the end of time, with pretty much River Song being the only real exception. It creates a very satisfying and distinct experience as a fan, and I've already made a whole video in the past talking about the value of such an interconnected semi-canon universe. It's living proof of how such a world can greatly benefit Doctor Who, that first Davies era being the height of the show's popularity. However, it's not sustainable on a larger scale, considering how the show is constantly ongoing. If you had tried to maintain that interconnected universe for the whole 14 years since the end of time, the show would probably have self-destructed and consumed itself by trying to adhere to canon and rules. The main charm of Doctor Who lies in its adaptability and its willingness to reinvent itself constantly, forcing the show to adhere adhere to a strict and rigid canon akin to the First Davis era would really stifle long-term creativity and limit storytelling potential, because it would always have to stay within this defined, restrictive box. And besides, despite the First Davis era having this idea of loose canon, it all just fell apart in the time since because other showrunners retconned stuff and added their own new lore, so again, it's just not sustainable for a long period. Doctor Who has no set canon, and that's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. For every positive, there's a negative to counterbalance it. Introducing a set canon would definitely open up Doctor Who more to newer audiences, defining clear entry points and essential stories both in the show and in expanded media. They wouldn't have to wade through all these conflicting storylines to find out what counts. And yet, as accessible as that would be, it would also have the exact opposite effect too, since 60 years of accepted canon would be so intimidating for newcomers and it would be really difficult for them to work out what does count, along with discouraging them from exploring things like Big Finish or novels. Doctor Who has always benefited from a more open-ended approach, allowing fans to explore the universe at their own leisure and almost pick and choose what resonates with them the most. It's up to them what their personal canon is. This does of course lead to a lot of arguments and confusion, so a set canon would create a sense of shared understanding by clearly defining things for everyone. However, this would also strip away some of the magic of Doctor Who. It's a media property that prides itself on its playful embrace of inconsistencies and paradoxes. Restricting narratives would force writers to constantly stumble over themselves to make sure everything fits, and we'd lose a lot of top tier stories because they wouldn't fit within the borders of established canon. It's undeniable that, from a business standpoint, a clear set canon would make it incredibly easy to manage the franchise, and unite different media and spin-offs under a single banner pushing one overall narrative. That would boost the brand a lot, but it's also kind of impossible by this point. Pandora's box was opened nearly 60 years ago, and you can't just introduce a canon now. There's undeniably a serious problem with all the fragmentation of licenses and obscure spin-offs, but that's just the way Doctor Who is, and there's no easy way to fix that without breaking plenty of other things. There's a loose idea of canon within certain Doctor Who media bubbles, and that's good enough for everyone to live with. So I genuinely don't think Doctor Who needs a canon, and I don't think it ever will need one. There's simply no point or long-term benefit to it. Although I still would like some more centralization of lore, just give me some more in-depth world building, please, I'm begging you. But yeah, those were just my scattered thoughts, which were probably more like the ramblings of a man with a cold that I'm coming on with. I hope you enjoyed this video, thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to quickly thank my Bantam level patrons, Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson, my Diamond level patron, Glenna Clark, my Platinum level patrons, Matthew Burns and Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons, Boots, Daniel Shillito, Franz Orn aka Lan Vortex, Leigh Marie Farrell, and Tom Azar. Thank you so much for your support.